Okay, hello everyone, my name is Morgan Baker and I am an accessibility specialist and game designer. Today we are going to be discussing where to begin games accessibility, and this is an introduction for all developers of any skills and professional levels. Consider this talk as your Accessibility 101 singular lecture. I'm mostly going to discuss what to know in terms of video games accessibility. I'm going to be defining accessibility in games, how to frame accessibility, designing with accessibility in mind, common challenges in games, and why everyone needs to be involved, as well as just generally the key takeaways. At any point, if you have a question, feel free to contact me, which you can find my information in the NZGDC platform or my website, leahybaker.com. You can also find me on Twitter at momoxmia, and I will respond to your tweets and DMs. First, what is accessibility? In the context of games, accessibility means breaking down barriers to ensure that everyone has an enjoyable player experience. Accessibility is neither expensive nor consuming to do on the very minimal level. Any designer has the ability and tools to make games accessible, tools we will talk about today, but it typically just comes down to knowing what we need to know and do. Sometimes accessibility itself can be intimidating. Sometimes we see development teams talk about the number of accessibility features they have, or the number of game developers they have working on accessibility, X number of user researchers, and Y number of programmers. And it sometimes feels like there's a lot of things we have to do to meet some sort of standard. But accessibility does not have a goalpost. As Ian Hamilton said in his most recent GDC talk, there is no fixed bar for you to hit or miss. Instead, look at accessibility as an optimization process. And honestly, I am completely inclined to agree with this mentality. Every single step you take to make your game accessible means more people can have an enjoyable yet accessible player experience. It's not some sort of all or nothing thing. It's a process and contextual to our specific games. So, as you listen to this talk, I encourage you to think about your games and be prepared to be creative with your design, as well as just your processes. Now, contextually, 1 in 4 people live with 1 or more disabilities in their life. Sometimes you see 1 in 5, it just depends on the country. Where we define disability as an impairment that limits 1 or more major life activity. This is a very American definition. And these activities can include walking, speaking, sitting, hearing, seeing, focusing, and the list just goes on and on. And disability can range from mild to moderate to severe, all the way to, say, profound. There is, in fact, no singular disability experience. Even if you have the same diagnosis, no 2 people will be identical. Typically, when we think of accessibility, these are the people we first think of and the people that come to mind. But the beauty of accessibility is just how applicable it is to any gamer. We can break the reasons someone would need accessibility into 3 categories. The first being permanent, meaning someone who has a condition that's unchanged. The second being temporary, such as someone who has an injury or infection. And the last category is situational, meaning perhaps someone who would still benefit from accessibility, even if they may not necessarily fall under these categories. And this you can see exemplified through the inclusive a Microsoft design toolkit. For example, let's take closed captions or subtitles. They benefit people who are deaf, such as myself. I'm profoundly deaf. Or perhaps if you have an ear infection and it's kind of hard to hear, that's really helpful to have subtitles too. Or maybe there's some patrons at a bar who cannot hear the television over the chatter and music of nightlife. In general, the people who might benefit from the accessibility the most are people you might not necessarily think of. By adding accessibility to our games, we are avoiding unnecessary barriers that would negatively impact people's enjoyment, whether it be for permanent, temporary, or situational reasons. But why should we care? Now, generally, there are two arguments for why we should make games accessible. The first is elevating those who have disabilities. Games are a form of entertainment and joy, as well as serve as just a piece of artistic medium. Some people use it as escapism, others will use it as a way to express themselves, or perhaps people use games as a form of socializing, whether it be through generated fandoms, multiplayer experiences, or simply chatting about their favorite games with friends. By including players with disabilities, we are promoting a form of inclusion as well as giving them just a form of independence and a medium of joy and something that just anyone can appreciate. And why should we not want to include gamers with disabilities in our games communities? Now, the second argument is perhaps a little more corporate, but there is a financial gain from making games accessible. Recall that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people have disabilities, and that's not including those who would benefit for situational reasons when it comes to accessible design. More accessibility means more gamers, which means more money, which means more games, and so the cycle continues. But another argument is considering the design itself. Ultimately, games are for everyone, but if us as game creators do not make meaningful strides to make our games accessible, we are not just leaving out a large demographic, but also not reaching the full potential of our design. Take these quotes on here. Good design is when some players have a challenging yet fun experience. Superb design is when all players have a challenging yet fun experience. By challenging ourselves to think about our design and how to make it accessible, we are essentially elevating ourselves as professionals to not just do what might be considered right, but also make our games genuinely better. Because what could be seen as just an accessibility feature should better be seen as an opportunity to offer better game design, furthering our field and breaking the boundaries of what is currently known. That's a lot. Now, we will discuss how to frame accessibility in games. Historically, accessibility has been used as a way to create, and I quote, equal access. Make sure everyone is equal and has the same opportunities regardless of abilities. However, though this does make sense in many fields, especially in, say, like educational contexts, the better way to frame accessibility in games is create accessible experiences. Too often we think of a game itself as being accessible, but what we should really focus on is the player experience and making the player experience accessible. We think of the player experience as what the player goes through when they play the game. How do the players experience the mechanics? What are their motivations? Is the game usable? Are the players actually having fun? Dave Ing cites that the player experience can be broken into 6 categories, such as motivation, meaningful choices, balance, usability, and aesthetics, as well as just fun. And ultimately, we experience games using our perceptions, meaning sight, hearing, and touch, and from there we process the information and make meaningful memories through said experiences. Able Gamers uses the APX triangle, and the APX standing for Accessibility Player Experiences. And they use this APX triangle to describe the phenomenon in the context of games accessibility, which if you have the time, I suggest you go check that out. But what we want to focus on is not just creating equal access, but also creating accessible experiences that make the game usable, challenging, yet fun. When we think about accessibility in the context of video games, we can actually break up games accessibility into 5 general categories. This first is motor accessibility, where motor accessibility pertains to the controls and mobility of the video game. Common accessibility features we will think of include simplified controls, as well as controls remapping. This is particularly helpful for those who may not be able to use a controller, or for those who may not be able to use a mouse or keyboard, or just require some other alternative way to perform inputs, such as like eye gaze. The ultimate example of the motor accessibility would be the Microsoft ZAC on this screen that we can see here, which is an accessible controller that allows for flexible hardware for those with fine motor or major mobility impairments. Our next category from here is hearing accessibility, for which is one of my specialties. Hearing accessibility pertains to those who have or are hard of hearing, deaf, or have auditory processing disorder. Common accessibility features for this category include closed captions, subtitles, and integrated visual cues. From here we have vision accessibility, and this can pertain to sight, colors, light, and displays, and most commonly we think of color blindness, which affects 8% of men, as well as visual processing disorders, but we also have those who may be low vision, blind, and sightless. Common accessibility features include colorblind friendly options, sizable HUD adjustments, menu narration, and unique audio cues. And this then leads us into cognitive accessibility, where this is related to thoughts, memory, and processing speed. Common accessibility features include simplified language, tutorials, hint systems, gore filters, and motion sickness options. In our last category, we have speech accessibility, and this includes voice chat and speech recognition. For this category, the most common accessibility features may be ping systems, text chat support, or other visual means to communicate with other players. However, now that we have these 5 categories, please keep in mind that though there may be fine, there is actually a ton of overlap between them in terms of disability as well as accessible design. For instance, someone can have both a motor-related and hearing-related disability at the same time, and additionally, an accessibility feature can target more than one category at any given time. For example, closed captions benefit those who may be deaf, as well as aid those who require cognitive access due to processing speed deficits. Categorizing accessibility in these 5 areas can be helpful though, especially as we ease ourselves into accessibility, because when you think about it, each one of these are a type of perception that we use to engage with the game. For motor, players perform inputs and engaging mechanics, and for hearing, we have sound design, and for vision, players may receive visual information to engage in gameplay, and for cognitive, players must internalize and think about our design, and for speech, there may be moments where players need to use oral means to communicate with other players in multiplayer settings. The 5 categories very nicely capture games in general, and by thinking about them in these 5 categories, we can better internalize how to make our games more accessible to as many people as possible, especially given, if you recall, anyone at any point can fall under one of these categories. Maybe you've broken your arm and need to play one-handed now, or maybe a baby is sleeping in the room and you want to keep it down, so you use text chat instead or turn on closed captions. For more in-depth breakdown of these 5 categories, I suggest that you go to gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. The core contributors did a absolutely lovely job cataloging and maintaining these guidelines, which are free for anyone to use. Now, there are typically 2 ways we can go about making our games more accessible. The first being baking accessibility straight into the game, which I swear accessibility people love using cake metaphors when we talk about accessibility. Baking accessibility is the idea that the game itself is inherently accessible due to core design decisions. For example, to assist those with color blindness, we can ensure no essential information is conveyed by color alone. Here are 2 images with a set of colored pencils. On the left, the image of the colored pencils is unaltered, whereas on the right, the image has been altered to show what the pencils look like to someone with color blindness. Can you spot the difference? Well, to millions with this specific type of color blindness, the 2 images look identical. Take, for example, the game 2 Dots, which uses both symbols and colors to convey the same information to combat color blindness. The design choice bakes accessibility straight into the product, as players can easily perceive information without any type of customization. We can also make our games more accessible by adding features into the menu, which this is very common to do. Customization is particularly helpful in contexts where it might be hard to predict what players might need in our games, And this is especially true as there are many different types of abilities and backgrounds, and as so we can give players the choice to decide what works best for them. An example, it wouldn't be an accessibility talk without bringing up Celeste, where players can use assist mode to customize the game to fit their individual needs. For this very difficult platforming game, players can change the game's speed, stamina, number of air dashes, as well as decide whether or not they would like to use an invincibility mode. It's incredible and revolutionary for the game and its genre. But when we come back to it, which is better, baking in accessibility or providing it as an option? Well, the answer is it just depends. Every game calls for different things. A game doesn't need a million options to be accessible, but sometimes it's hard to bake accessibility into our game as the design becomes more complex. It's fair to say that you will typically see both in action for any given title. And just so you know, if you accidentally make a feature that makes the design inherently accessible, happy accidents count, and it's still accessibility. This leads into my next point of making sure we basically consider accessibility early and often. Doing so will allow us to make decisions on whether or not accessibility should be baked straight into the content or provided as an accessibility option. Now, again, it wouldn't be a conversation about accessibility without a mention of universal design, which is a very big topic in education, the field that I came from previously. Universal design means creating products, services, and spaces that are accessible to all people regardless of age, disability, or other factors. And this topic should actually be reminiscent, if you think about it, of the Microsoft Toolkit, right? Which shows that anyone can benefit from accessibility. It basically derives from educational practices, and it helps teachers make their curriculums more accessible to students. However, in modern day, universal design is used in almost any area of accessibility and inclusivity initiatives. There are in total 4 principles that are outlined in universal design. We have equitable in use, flexible in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and the last one, which I think I might be cutting it off, is size and space for approach and use. There are plenty of examples of products that are designed with these principles. For example, we can think of an elevator. Elevators benefit those with physical disabilities who may be using a walker or wheelchair. However, it's particularly helpful too if you're pushing your baby in a stroller and you're trying to get to the 5th floor, or you're carrying a very heavy box up a flight of stairs. Similarly, universal design transcends beyond international borders, which is very cool to see. A stop sign in Malaysia is still easily recognizable to a New Zealand citizen, and thanks to its typical octagon shape and distinct red colors and white outlines, we basically can see it and understand what it means. And though there may be small discrepancies within the sign and its design, it's ultimately perceptible enough to transcend language itself. But above all, universal design means creating a design that is beneficial to everyone. An example would be Uncharted 4, where they included extensive accessibility features related to motor skills, including button mapping, simplified controls, and so on. In particular, some of the features benefit those who game with one hand using a single stick. That would include, using camera assist, lock on aim, and more. And now Ian Hamilton, a game specialist that I mentioned earlier, he points out that people who have one hand typically make up for less than 1% of the population. And yet, as it turns out, almost 30% of the player base use these features, since they ultimately universally benefit anyone. So that's really cool to see universal design in practice in the video games industry. As we're digesting this information of universal design, we've learned about the categories. How do we design with accessibility in mind? Well, when considering designing with accessibility, I will provide to you a universal approach that's helpful for most, if not all, games. The first is making sure the design is clear and intuitive. Information is distinguishable, channels are clear, and the input or outputs are intuitive in itself. But what do I mean by clear channels? Channels are the concept of different means of perceiving information from a video game. We see a screen, we hear the audio, we feel our controllers, and so on. Making the channels clear means that the information can be easily taken in by the player and from there processed and understood. You can learn more about the channels from that APX triangle I mentioned earlier. And additionally, we want to make sure that the corresponding inputs and outputs related to these channels are in themselves intuitive in nature. What are some ways we can go about making sure information is clear and accessible to everyone? For example, if a change of a color, such as graying out text, icons, or objects, is used to inform the player that the specific thing is no longer available, another method should be used as well, as according to the Xbox accessibility guidelines. This is achieved in Sea of Thieves, where items for purchase that are currently locked aren't only just grayed out, but they also have a lock symbol like all the way across it, indicating that the item is not available. Additionally, we can provide players with the ability to review tasks and objectives at any given point. Descriptions of tasks and objectives should essentially be very clear and straightforward. Take this example from the game Grounded. Objectives appear on the screen for players to reference at any time, and the game also provides a list of subtasks for each main objective, such as unblock the obscured laser and find whatever is weakening one of the lasers, so that basically players have a clear understanding on how to complete this overall objective. This leads into the next approach for all games, which is providing multiple channels. This means information can be accessed through multiple modalities in a clear and consistent way. If channels are the different ways we perceive information, having multiple channels means giving players several ways to access, process, and understand content at the same time. So perhaps information that is visual is also auditory. This can either be baked straight into the game or provided as a separate option. Take, for instance, Fortnite, which provides the ability to visualize sound effects. Within the visualization, there are visual cues such as treasure chests, gliders, gunshots, and footsteps, and additionally, colors within the visualization help distinguish which sounds are neutral versus which sounds are dangerous. Opacity is also used to indicate the distance of the sound. Therefore, players are not only able to listen to sound effects, but they can also see them as well should the option be turned on. And as mentioned, for multiple channels, you can either have this baked straight into the game or provide it as a customizational option in the game's menu. For instance, in Fortnite, visualize sound effects is an option you need to turn on in the audio menu, and can be universally beneficial to anyone, ranging from those who have a hearing disability or maybe those who are playing on mobile without headphones. And as we discussed, this feature is beneficial to permanent, temporary, and situational conditions. However, take the game Hyperscape by Ubisoft. Hyperscape offers similar visualized sound effects, but rather than having players turn on these multiple channels in the game's menu, it's automatically turned on for everyone, and so these multiple channels and accessible design are actually baked straight into the game, or baked straight into the cake. No one is necessarily better than the other, meaning should we bake it or should we give it as an option? But either way, both development teams made a successful effort in making sure that their games are accessible with the use of multiple channels. Lastly, we want to make sure our game is flexible, meaning players can adjust displays, sound, difficulty, controls, and entries to meet their needs. Which I realize I might be cutting. I can move myself over, cutting it off. Let's take an example. where we can let players customize audio sliders. In Overwatch, designers provide players a master volume and separate sliders for the sound effects, music volume, and in-game voice volume. We can also provide them subtitles for all critical gameplay, conversations, or anything else that's relevant. Flexible design in particular is important if a game might be played on different platforms or played in different ways, such as a controller versus a mouse and keyboard versus a mobile device. Let's take this example from New Zealand's own studio Pickpock. The premise of their game, Into the Dead, has players running around a field of zombies, then you have to dodge them, otherwise the zombies will eat the player and it's essentially game over. And throughout development, the controls for the game were tilting the mobile device to determine which direction the player will run. But right toward the end of development, a user researcher named Hadley Bellum persuaded the team to consider accessibility options, because though tilting the device feels really, really fun, he wanted to include players with disabilities in too. For instance, it might be hard to pick up a tablet and move it if you have a disability related to mobility or something. So the designers agreed and add alternatives, including a left and right button for each side of the touch screen, as well as just a screen thumbstick where players can decide if it'll be on the left and right side, totaling up to 4 different control schemes. And though the tilt option was certainly the most fun for a lot of players, the designers were willing to add these options for this potentially small group of people who might find it helpful. As it turns out, they tracked the user data, and the data showed that for these 4 options on this PowerPoint in front of you, the usage data came out with an even 4-way split. 25% of players used tilt, 25 used the left and right button, and so on. It was a perfect 25, 25, 25, 25, give or take. So this gesture, which was originally intended for accessibility, ended up being used universally by everyone. It is incredible. And if you want to learn more about Pickpock's story, please check out the talk Gaming and Accessibility Bootcamp, Myths and Reasons from 2017, which goes into a little more depth. Now that we've talked about some general ways we can approach accessibility in terms of design, what are the most common accessibility features? Feels like we've already talked a lot about them, but let's just hash it out really quickly together. On this PowerPoint, there is a non-exhaustive list of common features that you may see in video game titles. The first being subtitles and closed captions, which is one of my specialties, and this essentially means creating text for dialogue and sound effects. Subtitles and closed captions may be one of the more common accessibility features, likely even one of the most important for hearing accessibility. The difference between subtitles and closed captions are pretty simple. Subtitles basically pertain to the dialogue, where closed captions pertain to both the dialogue and sound effects. The names are not immediately intuitive, and I'm sorry about that, but I didn't make these terms up. Otherwise, maybe I would change it. Here we see an example from The Last of Us Part 2. Notice how the size is fairly easy to read, and for this title they offer 3 different size options, and this is just like the normal option. Additionally, you may notice that there is a black letter box right behind the actual text to assist with contrast and readability, and you may also see the speaker name, in this case a WLF soldier, in orange. The color helps distinguish the different speakers but is completely optional. You may also see that there is a very subtle arrow to the left of the subtitle. This arrow is to assist in understanding exactly where the sound is coming from. Subtitle system in The Last of Us Part 2 is exceptional, and for any given title, if there is spoken dialogue or sound effects, subtitles and closed captions are an essential. In fact, David Tisserand, senior manager from accessibility at Ubisoft, advised their developers to have subtitles automatically turned on in their games, and as so, user data showed that for the titles where the subtitles were the default option, 97% of players kept them on for Far Cry New Dawn, and 95% of players kept them on for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, showing just how sought after subtitles are for the general audience. In fact, as a deaf game developer, I have had many gamers, developers, friends, and even strangers tell me how they prefer watching Netflix with subtitles because it helps with comprehension. Moving on, the next common accessibility feature that is crucial for players of all abilities is just remappable controls. This essentially gives the player the freedom to reassign inputs. According to the game accessibility guidelines, remappable controls are one of the best value accessibility features, and I'm inclined to agree. To anyone with a motor or mobility condition, whether it be permanent, temporary, or situational, all highly benefit from remappable controls. For instance, if you break your arm, you might be gaming with one hand for a little while. Here we see an example from Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where players are able to customize the keyboard and mouse controls to be whatever is easiest for them. You may also notice that players can adjust things like aiming sensitivity, mouse acceleration, as well as the mouse X and Y axis. Players will also recount how it's helpful for them to be able to change inputs from a hold to a tap to a toggle. A lovely quote from a gamer named Louie is, "I have now just the right arm. I have not been able to enjoy many games for this reason. I was going to uninstall the game like all other games when I see that I cannot play them. Then I found the control options and I was overjoyed." Remappable controls are the difference between a game being playable and not playable. So it's important for us as game creators to make sure that players have the option to change the controls in our games as needed. And keep in mind, even if there is a system-wide way to remap controls, it is still recommended to offer that within your game, because the system-wide option is just supposed to be a safety net and it is not a solution. Moving on, our next accessibility feature is high contrast, meaning make sure text and objects are easily distinguishable. But you can also include other things that pertain to important parts of a game, such as the HUD and UI. Color contrast refers to the difference in light between font or anything in the foreground and its background. Two colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, as we see on the left, do not contrast very well, whereas two colors on the opposite side of the color wheel contrast very nicely. A contrast ratio is the difference in luminance values between that foreground and background of the element. The highest possible contrast is 21:1, which would essentially be black on white or white on black. And the lowest is 1:1, which would be the color just on top of itself. The Xbox Accessibility Guidelines recommends a minimum of a 7:1 contrast, and if you want to check the contrast of elements, you can look up webaim.org or just Google contrast checker, and that will help you out in determining whether or not your UI or your HUD or your elements are contrasting well. Take the game Hyperdot, which features both a dark and light contrast mode. When this mode is enabled, all visual elements presented have a 7:1 contrast ratio against their background. Similar to other accessibility features, you can either bake this straight into your game or provide it as an option. It really just depends on what game you're making. This leads us into our next accessibility feature very nicely, which would be colorblind friendly options. I know I actually mentioned this earlier, that it's important for information to not be conveyed by just color alone, and I've already given a few examples of this being done. In the event that you need additional assistance due to elements of your core, you can also let players turn on a colorblind filter to assist them. Take the game Sea of Thieves again. The designers offer the ability to turn on a color blindness filter mode, and this allows players of varying colorblind backgrounds to adjust and select what option is basically just best for them. In fact, there's actually software called Color Oracle, where Color Oracle is a free color blindness simulator on the Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it takes all the guesswork out of your designing, and you can actually see what is or is not working. And that is Color Oracle. And though we avoid relying on color alone to communicate information, sometimes it's not always possible. Alternatively, we can provide players the option to choose the color of any key element, taking Call of Duty Black Ops as an example, where players can change the color of themselves, their allies, their enemies, their party to whatever color they want. True that there are presets, but in the case that it might not work, designers went out of their way to let players just pick the exact color. Shifting over into our next feature, we see that's very common is tutorials or some type of training ground. This is designed to give players time to learn mechanics and in other instances go back and review information if they do not recall the exact gameplay and controls. It's also considered good design just in general, but also like maybe a quality of life thing, but in general it can make or break a game for many individuals. Take the game Immortals Fenyx Rising as an example. It is an open world RPG with a massive storyline and many dungeons, and to ease players into it, the player is first placed on an island with a limited amount of content that's essentially their training ground, and it's exemplary. Without it, many players get overwhelmed by mechanics and content, and they just basically gave them a safe place to explore, and this is generally just considered good design. However, in a way, the game doesn't really end there in terms of tutorials. Players are constantly learning new skills and gain new items, and it's hard to track everything. So at any point in the game, players can access the tutorial in the game's menu, and it provides information on the basics and advanced skills, as well as things like inventory, potions, map, and so on. This is universally beneficial to permanent, temporary, or situational conditions. For example, if you have issues with memory, you can always just go back to the tutorial, or maybe you put the game down for an extended period of time and you just need a quick refresher. Our last common feature, which I'm covering, so I'll just move myself up here for a second, is difficulty and assist modes. In essence, this means challenges can be adjusted to aid the progression of the game at potentially any given point. We often see difficulty modes pop up at the beginning of the game, prompting players to pick what's best for them. Down I go again. Take, for instance, Horizon Zero Dawn. Here, players can choose between 6 different options, ranging from story and easy all the way to very hard, and ultra hard. Notice how each mode has a description and an explanation for what the mode is intended to do for the player. For example, story mode is intended as a difficulty setting that eases combat, allowing you to focus on exploration and narrative. And at any given point, players can change the difficulty, and this is amazing design. Keep in mind, difficulty adjustments can come in many shapes, sizes, and forms. For instance, a roguelike game, Hades, players can turn on a feature named God Mode, which is God Mode essentially gives players a subtle but impactful boost every time they die. Recently, actually, when I was chatting with some designer friends over virtual drinks, we discovered that all 4 of us played Hades using God Mode. Each reason varied. One designer joked that she works too many hours in God Mode ensured that she would be able to beat the game in a timely manner. Another said that God Mode made his experience genuinely more enjoyable, as he typically does not reach for roguelike games, and found it as a nice middle ground. And the last used it for physical reasons, noting that she struggles with fine motor control and found God Mode made the game more accessible to her. No matter the reason and abilities, all of us used God Mode for different reasons and found the option beneficial as well as genuinely revolutionary. Now, I just want to bring up too real quickly, remember how I mentioned that accessibility can elevate our potential as designers? God Mode is the essence of this virtue. Supergiant Games pushed the boundaries of their beloved genre, and as so expanded their audience and brought genuinely impressive design to the games industry, influencing current as well as the many developers to come. For more helpful resources that are great for just any developer, I suggest you check out the IGDA Games Accessibility SIG, where leaders have taken the time to collect articles, resources, papers, and guidelines. So go check it out. I'm covering the link. So I'll raise myself for a second, screenshot it, and I'm done. Now that we've discussed some common accessibility features, I was also requested to discuss potentially some common accessibility challenges. So what are these common challenges? And don't worry, before you fret, there are solutions. I got you. The first challenge is ambiguous design, where ambiguous design refers to when the design itself is inherently unclear or not immediately intuitive to the user. Take, for instance, a player that is dropped into a world and is not given any directions, objectives, or apparent tools. This can work for some titles, but can be detrimental to others. We particularly see this in what I call, and my age will show, the earlier, I'm quoting it, ages of at-home gaming. In 1992, Echo the Dolphin was published. This is a series of action-adventure video games imported to many systems, and the game, though it is beloved, is in retrospect a good example of ambiguous design. For when players are dropped into this underwater world and stuck in an enclosed area, little does the player know, in order to trigger the main story, they must perform a series of unlisted tasks. For many players, they will not get past this area, at least without some sort of online assistance, as the tasks are inherently unclear. And even if we do progress through this enclosed area, the player is never given any type of direction on what they need to do, where they need to go, besides some occasional riddles from random NPCs. To a player with cognitive conditions, whether they be permanent, temporary, situational, this game is unbeatable. And what's clear to us as game creators may not always be clear to the players. So what do we do when we have ambiguous design? Well, for one, perform user research early and often. This includes playtests, surveys, interviews, usability studies, and more. We don't deserve user researchers. Use them because they are there to help you. From there, don't be afraid to add to your design, including color coding, player maps, quest tracking, and more. And in the worst case scenario, and I see I'm covering it a little bit, don't be afraid to revisit your core design and head back to the drawing board as needed. Because one of the hardest things when it comes to games accessibility is combating any type of ambiguity. We cannot move forward with games accessibility unless the design is clear and clean. And the last common accessibility challenge, I'm getting ahead of myself. The second common accessibility challenge is conflicting elements, meaning making one game component accessible makes the other inaccessible. This is particularly relevant when you have multiple disabilities at the same time. For instance, someone with a cognitive-related condition may need frequent hints and subtitles and additional HUD adjustments. However, sometimes we see cognitive conditions can coincide with visual processing disorder, but by adding all of these things to our screen, we're suddenly making the screen really busy and perhaps even triggering. So what do? For one, we can add customization to our game, and this is applicable for any conflicting element. Basically, just let players decide what would work best for them. For example, in Assassin's Creed, the HUD and UI can be extremely fine-tuned. Players can adjust the menu font size, icon size, HUD configuration, HUD background, compass, icon distance, objective theme, colorblind options, and the list, we can just literally scroll forever. Basically, not only is this helpful for accessibility and combating these conflicting elements, but it's also just an extremely powerful quality of life tool. And don't forget that Assassin's Creed is indeed a very complex game. Hence, you see more options here. So don't be intimidated and think, oh, I need to have all of these to meet some sort of benchmark. Work and do what's best for your game. And now our last common accessibility challenge is something called a fundamental alteration, or basically this is the idea that accessibility is seemingly alters our core design, so that adding accessibility would significantly change our vision. It actually turns out, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one because this is a very advanced challenge, but these instances are typically very rare, and a lot of it comes down to just needing to ask the right questions and educating ourselves on accessibility. And I have a whole GDC talk that I did this year in 2021, on this topic. So for advanced learners, I suggest you go check that out on the GDC website or YouTube, wherever it is now. So to wrap things up, at the end of the day, accessibility is a team effort and every single person needs to be involved. Whether you are a user researcher, a gameplay programmer, UI UX designer, producer, creative director, game designers, everyone needs to be on board for accessibility. The lead game designers from Naughty Dog, a studio that has been celebrated for their robust accessibility, say that accessibility at that level was only possible because every single person was involved. Every single person partook in accessibility efforts. Whether they were quality assurance, engineers, sound designers, every single person contributed to accessibility and helped squash accessibility related bugs. And accessibility on the highest level has every single person involved. So next time you are in a meeting, do not be afraid to bring up accessibility. Educate your coworkers, give them resources, and be a positive source of change. Because at the end of the day, every single person deserves to game. Because when we all game, we all win. So some key takeaways: consider accessibility early and often, bake accessibility straight into your game, or provide customization options as needed, hold each other accountable, and keep everyone involved. Because what could be seen as accessibility should better be seen as an opportunity to involve more gamers and create better design. Thank you so much for coming out to my talk today. If you have any questions or if you have any thoughts, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, which is at Leahy Baker, Twitter, which is at MomoXMia, or connect with me on my website, leahybaker.com. I will be checking my DMs and my email frequently. I think also the New Zealand GDC will also have that information on my portal as well. Other great resources for you if you are pumped and you want to go out and learn more: gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, gamesforchange.org, ablegamers.org, the IGDA, gameaccessibilitysig.org, gameaccess.info, Microsoft SAG, Can I Play That, Game Accessibility Nexus, and Dagger System. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.